Hi there, welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh. This is Gizmo and Widget, my travelling companions. And welcome back to our series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. We're travelling on your behalf through the centre of the Cotswolds, seeking out smaller places you might easily not come across, little villages, churches, even the occasional artefact. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. Today you find Ross, Widget, Gizmo and me in the tiny village of Saintbury. This little village hangs on the edge of the Cotswold escarpment, but it has an important church in it. We're going to show you around and tell you its slightly sad story. Come with me. There is no doubt that the job Ross and I do, travelling around the lovely villages of the Cotswolds, picking the prettiest and most interesting places and avoiding as much as possible the gruesome intrusion of the 21st century, is as pleasant a job as it's possible to imagine. Just occasionally, however, things don't quite turn out as expected. Our starting point in this episode of Hidden Gems is Saintbury, a tiny hamlet on the western escarpment of the Cotswold, just a stone's throw from the fantastically famous town of Broadway. It's a place we might easily have passed by. It's a slightly straggly place, with some beautiful farm buildings and some fine houses, both large and small, but it is the church that drew us, and that sits outside the village, high on the hill. Our interest was sparked by Herbert Evans, our trusted travelling companion from the very start of our travels, who wrote in 1905, "It was as vicar of Weston and of Saintbury that one of the pioneers of the new learning in England spent the evening of his days." This was the learned and modest William Latimer, the friend of Grocyn, Linacre and Erasmus. Himself a Fellow of All Souls, he shares with the two former the honour of planting the study of Greek at Oxford. Like Grocyn, he left behind him hardly any written proofs of his scholarship, but both for his intellectual and moral worth we have the unimpeachable testimony of Erasmus. In one of his epistles he styles him vere theologus integritate vitae conspicuous. In another, he begs Latimer to help him prepare a second edition of his Greek Testament for the press, from which Latimer excused himself on the ground that he had not touched Latin or Greek for some years and was engaged in other studies. He died in 1545 and was buried in Saintbury churchyard. I'm told that in the east window may be seen the figure of an ecclesiastic in the attitude of prayer, with the legend, San Nicholas Priet Pur W.L. This is most likely a portrait of Latimer. We, however, were unable to see this important relic, let alone show it to you. In 2017, the church was visited by vandals of a heartless type. They stole the lead from the roof, leaving this lovely little church at the mercy of the elements. We understand that very considerable water damage was done to the building itself and its contents. The church is in the capable hands of the Churches Conservation Trust, and we know they launched an appeal for funds to restore this lovely church, but despite several attempts, we've been unable to contact the right people to see if we could help, and the relevant fundraising page on their website appears to have been taken down. It's a mystery I will endeavour to solve over the next few weeks. I suppose it's possible that they've raised all the money they need and are about to start full repairs. I do hope so. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around this tiny hamlet of Saintbury. It's a pretty place. Hopefully once this church has finally had its work done, and we will keep you posted on that, you'll come and visit and support it. From here we make our way south to the lovely little village of Snowshill. Now we've been here before, a long time back, as a kind of unexpected visit while we were looking at other things, and it was midwinter, somewhat appropriately considering its name. This time though we've come back in the summer, just at the beginning of the summer, and it's transformed this place. It's absolutely beautiful. The hawthorns are out, the hedges are looking white and full of blossom. It's just extraordinary. I've just been talking to one of the Oxford guides, and he was saying that if he wants to show his people the perfect quintessential English village, he brings them here. I agree with him, and we're going to look around. Come with me. It's always wonderful when we're on location to be greeted by fans of the channel, and we were thrilled in Snowshill today to be able to chat to visitors from the United States, as well as a couple of professional guides from Bath, all of whom were friends of the Cotswold explorer. That's the thing about this little village. It gives you a strong feeling that all's well with the world. As one of the guides told us, if he's asked by his visitors to show them a quintessential Cotswold village, he brings them here to Snowshill. It does all the things you hope a Cotswold village will do. It nestles in a fold in the hills, wrapped up and protected from the wild winds from the west. The steep lanes are lined with lovely 17th century cottages, built just haphazardly enough so as not to create a regimented feel. The local building stone we've come to love so much, dug from the ground no more than a few miles from here, gives that wonderful warm glow to the place. It feels almost as though it has risen from the earth of its own accord. I suppose this village perfectly represents what it is we love about the Cotswolds. It seems to illustrate a more simple way of life from an earlier age, where the human race lived by the sweat of its brow, using whatever came to hand to build shelter, huddling together for warmth, protection and support against a harsh outside world. It's a cosy and comforting image, and of course, almost a complete fantasy. The truth is that life for the people who built these lovely cottages was harsh. Poverty was grinding, and life was extremely fragile. Having said that, their legacy is amazing. My instinct is to be delighted that there seems to be very little invasion of the 21st or even 20th century in Snowshill. And it's true that the housing developers seem to have been kept largely at bay, but even the preconception that modern additions are always unwelcome is challenged in this village. The church, standing as it does in the very centre of the village, is by local standards extremely modern. The villagers have been worshipping here since around the middle of the first millennium. No one seems to know what happened to the original church, but the one we see today was built as recently as 1864. In its time, a very modern addition to an ancient village. We can't even be sure of the architect, although Pevsner suggests it might have been Henry Day of Worcester, but the unusual thickness of the walls might suggest someone lacking in the confidence needed to produce a building of elegance. Having said that, this church definitely has a hefty degree of charm. There was clearly a serious lack of funds available to build it. Indeed, the whole church was put up for £1,700 or so. For example, the stone lips over the arches, called hood moulds, designed to shed water, were meant to be carved and decorated, but in this church they are plain, clunky, and not very attractive. The tower is ill-proportioned with a blunt, heavy parapet. The intended spire would have helped, but they ran out of money, so instead there was a pyramid-like top put on the tower. Even that was removed in 1958, leaving the flat top we see today, without even battlements to relieve the plain lines. But there is a good, solid country charm about this building that comforts the visitor and suits the feeling of the village that surrounds it. There are a couple of good old objects in the church. The 15th century font with a new oak cover dedicated to John Hands, clerk of the parish for 50 years, and a Jacobean pulpit from around 1640. The stained glass, mostly, if not all, in memory of the Marshall family, is very good for the period, and apart from the east window, mostly by Frederick Preedy, a Victorian architect who, very unusually for the time, designed and made his own stained glass. We've come across him recently in Gloucester Cathedral. There's also a good war memorial cross in the southeast corner by F.L. Griggs. And if you're lucky enough to be here when the bell's being rung, you can revel in the fact that it was cast as early as 1350. The local pub, the Snowshill Arms, is a friendly local hostelry that has avoided the massive 21st century gentrification trend of pubs in the Cotswolds, and offers a delightfully old-fashioned pub grub menu and some terrific local beer. We suggest a visit before heading for the unusual National Trust House at the top of the village called Snowshill Manor. I say unusual because in the case of this building it isn't the house itself that's of any particular interest, but the truly amazing collection of artefacts contained within. Originally, until the dissolution of the monasteries, the building belonged to Winchcombe Abbey. By 1919, it was in a pretty derelict condition, and it was bought by Charles Paget Wade, an eccentric architect, artist, craftsman, and avid collector. He set about a thorough restoration in the arts and crafts spirit and packed it with his amazing magpie collection. One day, when we've managed to negotiate access to the National Trust properties to film, we may well come back here to show you this extraordinary collection. This part of the world never stops giving us fascinating places to visit, and Snowshill is certainly one of them. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Snowshill. I do love this little church. I just love the idea that they ran out of money before they could build the spire. There's something appeals to me about that. It's lovely. We've enjoyed going around it again. Remember, this is a sort of village to pass through. It's very small. The lanes are narrow. They won't welcome coaches. But I think we've enjoyed ourselves. From here at Snowshill, we're travelling back over our own footprints, north, all the way to Weston Sub Edge. There's been a settlement at Weston Subedge since Roman times, and by the Norman invasion of 1066, it was a valuable manor. The Domesday Book recorded its owner in 1086 as Anfrid de Cormeilles, a man who owned lots of land across Gloucestershire. He married into the powerful de Lacy family, the same Lacys who owned, and actually still own, Stanway House, which we visited with such pleasure last year. And his heirs retained his estates until the male line of his family failed in the early 13th century. They built a manor house at Weston Subedge no later than the 12th century, probably replacing an existing structure. In 1269, the manor passed into the hands of Godfrey Gifford, Bishop of Worcester, who built the church right next to his house. In 1302, when he died, it passed to one John Gifford. Unfortunately, John chose to join the Duke of Lancaster in his rebellion against Edward II, and he was hanged at Gloucester after the king defeated the rebels at the Battle of Borough Bridge in 1322. Weston Subedge was briefly taken into Crown ownership, but was eventually restored to the Gifford family, who hung on to it until 1608. Today, all that remains of this fortified manor house are the earthworks of the square moat. The manor house itself was demolished in the early 19th century, and we don't really know what it looked like. But highly unusually, the land on which it sat is for sale at the moment. Of course, it's highly protected, and the chances of anyone buying a piece of this ground being allowed to do anything except stand and stare at it are extremely remote. So strict are the rules that it's unlikely you would even be allowed to put up a fence around your land in case the fence posts disturb something important underground. Nevertheless, it is a rather remarkable opportunity to own a piece of medieval manor ground, and I can't deny feeling a slight temptation to make inquiries. Please don't tell my wife. The church that Godfrey built in the 14th century is of course still here, although hugely altered during the 19th century by an increasingly famous architect and stained glass maker, Frederick Preedy. Dedicated to St Lawrence, although formerly to St John the Baptist, the church has an original and lovely western tower in the Perpendicular style, with 3 diagonal buttresses, gargoyles and pinnacles. Preedy started his restoration in 1849, but really got going in 1853. In the following 8 years, he transformed this church into what you see today. His windows are impressive. He was extremely unusual for his time, indeed for any time really, in that he was an architect who designed his own stained glass windows, but also made them himself. This set of windows show his work in various stages of his career, and are certainly worth coming here for, all on their own. But there is a good stone reredos, probably mid-19th century, a square, bold 20th century font, perched on an early English Gothic base, a Jacobean pulpit of the kind with which we've become very familiar. There's a royal arms to Queen Anne, and a marble tablet with flaming urns dedicated to the spectacularly named Faramus Fiennes, who died in 1708. There's a great brass on the wall to William Hodges, who died in 1590, with an 80-centimetre figure of which in the old days, when that kind of thing was allowed, I would certainly have tried to take a brass rubbing. And there's a recumbent effigy of one Captain Francis Bourne, with sword and helmet, who died in 1880 and must have been a distinguished soldier. The streets of this lovely village are lined with some lovely 17th century buildings, predominantly built with the Cotswold stone we know so well, but a couple built in the style more familiar in Stratford territory, black and white with wood frames, reminding us that once again we have stepped just a little out of our home territory. We've been lucky enough to visit many beautiful and peaceful villages on this western edge of the Cotswolds, and this little place of Weston Sub Edge is as beautiful as any. Also, it boasts a really nice pub. It's at the bottom of the slope on the main road, and it's called the Seagrave Arms. Ross and I stopped off for some lunch here, and we were welcomed with friendliness and enthusiasm by the new management, who had the terrifying misfortune to have embarked on this business just as the pandemic struck. They have survived with hard work and determination, and judging by the delicious lunch we had, they will continue to do really well. If it works out for you, drop in for a bite, or even stay a night or two, and give them our regards. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Weston Subedge. We've had a very nice time here. We had a delicious lunch. We might even put an offer in for the field. We're heading east now to the Warwickshire border and a great little place called Todenham. Now, it was a recommendation that we come here from Diana in Northamptonshire, which I'm grateful to you, Diana, very grateful indeed for introducing us to this place. It's a beautiful village and we're going to show you around. The church at the moment is not open, sadly, and it's an interesting part of the story of this village is that some of it doesn't appear to be quite as successful as you might have thought. We're going to show you around. Come with me. I suppose the first impression of this little village was a little less than auspicious. It's true it looked well groomed, the houses are looked after, but everything seemed just a little too deserted, and the two crucial buildings at the top of the main drag, the pub and the church, standing next to one another in what felt like mutual despair, were closed up and apparently unloved and decaying. It's odd, this thing of first impressions. It's very easy to make assumptions that can turn out to be entirely wrong. However, I don't think it unreasonable to be concerned when these two crucial elements of a community appear to be so ignored. Of course, we arrived here having found out quite a lot about the great history of this place, but we had absolutely no insight into the 21st century goings-on in the village. It didn't take us long to find out a bit more. Todenham is first mentioned in a charter dated 804 AD, when it was part of the kingdom of Mercia. It seems Ethelric bequeathed the village of Todenham to Deerhurst Abbey in return for being buried here. He certainly had a good eye for a heavenly place to lay to rest. It remained in the hands of Deerhurst for around 200 years. In the late 10th century, Deerhurst Abbey's assets were seized by a local warlord who passed it on to his relative, King Edward the Confessor. In 1065, the dying king granted Todenham to the institution closest to his heart, Westminster Abbey, and they held it for over 460 years. At the dissolution, it passed inevitably into the hands of the Crown and was gifted to one of Thomas Cromwell's most trusted lieutenants, Sir William Petre, and whilst it seems neither he nor any of his descendants ever visited the place, they owned it for over 250 years. In 1783, they sold it to the Derbyshire family of Pole, descendants of the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. They and their descendants owned the manor until the middle of the 20th century, at which point the estate was divided up and sold. The enclosures of the 16th century had altered the make-up of the settlement considerably, as they did so many of the communities in this region. And during the second phase of enclosure in the 18th century, the village started to look more like what we see today. It almost feels like two separate villages. So along come Ross and me to visit this place with such a distinguished history, and we do what we always tend to do, which is to head for the church. You could easily say that you only do that because it's easy to find, and you would be partially right. Churches do stand out, and they normally sit somewhere close to the heart of the village. In this case, it sits at the end of the village, but clearly it has always been treated as the centre of the community. The pub, the Farrier's Arms, is right next to the church, and the section of the village is known as Church End. The most obviously noticeable thing is that the very ancient pub building, whilst it has a long and interesting history of its own, is in a state of desperate decay and clearly hasn't operated as a hostelry for quite a while. This kind of sight always upsets me. Obviously there could be all kinds of reasons for this state of affairs, but as usual I jump to the conclusion that someone, probably a pub company, is holding out for permission to turn the building into a house, for which they'd get a lot more money than selling it as a pub. This kind of thing is happening all over the Cotswolds, and it has the potential to destroy communities. Just as I was composing in my mind a tirade about the curse of the pubcos, we were greeted by the friendly opposite neighbours, who came out of their home and told us that the building belonged to a real person who hadn't managed to make the pub work himself, but was trying extremely hard to sell it as a potential business. Well, I got that wrong then. We wish him the very best of luck. Just at that moment, however, Ross came back to tell me that the church was locked. This was a bit of a blow, so I followed him up the path to the church door, where fortunately we found a very friendly notice on the wall of the porch telling us where to go to find a key. Things were looking up again. The church, dedicated to St Thomas of Becket, is well worth the trouble to gain access. It was almost entirely rebuilt in the 14th century, of local stone with a Welsh slate roof. This is a bit of a rarity in the Cotswolds. The tower, of ashlar stone, has 2 stages with diagonal buttresses, and the spire is octagonal with unusual solid pinnacles at the corners. In 1768, the spire was so severely damaged in a storm it had to be completely rebuilt about 4 years later. The eastern window is beautiful, with some excellent stained glass, made in 1879 by Lavers, Barrow and Westlake. There is a plain but seemly pulpit of no great importance, but there is an early 19th century Royal Arms, altered at a later date to include the VR monogram. Looking up, there is a beautiful medieval trussed roof to the chancel. The font is 13th century, with a circular bowl, with a rather later pedestal, and it was restored to the church by the church wardens in 1773. They celebrated this achievement by having their names engraved in the stone. Some might say a little OTT, and possibly even vandalism, but surely signs of an unwelcome vanity. There are various memorials to the Pole family and others, including war memorials. And the church is extremely well kept and watched over, but I do get the impression that there's not a great deal of activity here. But given my record of judgment in this village, I may be completely wrong. There are a couple of rather wonderful chest tombs surrounded by wrought iron railings just outside the church porch, which deserve respect and attention, but are completely overgrown and inaccessible, and that isn't the best of signs. We returned the keys to the delightfully kind custodian, and I really should have asked him for more information, but I had troubled him enough, and I'm not good at pushing my luck. I'm told there's a wonderful farm shop on the local estate. Perhaps we'll visit them sometime and see what they have to offer. As a final experience with the locals, all of whom were friendly, helpful and kind, we met a man who was very pleased to see us. He has a holiday let in the village and hopes we might encourage visitors. Well, I'm very happy to oblige. Todenham deserves a visit from anyone travelling in this area. Leaving Todenham, we're heading into the heart of the ritzy Cotswolds, the stamping ground of Jeremy Clarkson, Soho House, and Lady Bamford's Dalesford. We're off to look at a stunningly beautiful little window. We're in the little village of Sandford St Martin. Now, we've been here before, actually. We tried to film here during the middle of the pandemic, but we found the church to be in a state of repair. It was being repaired in a very big way. So we've come back to see what they've achieved. And we're very excited. We're going to show you around. I've been meaning to show you the village of Sandford St Martin as a Cotswold gem for a number of years now. When we first visited, we found the church closed for repairs, and what with one thing and another, we never managed to return. Now, in the summer of 2022, I am delighted finally to be back here. The village is delightful. It's on the edge of the famous Great Tew estate and close to the epicentre of what, for want of a better phrase, I'll call the new Cotswolds. That part of this amazing area of outstanding natural beauty that has been taken over by wealthy Londoners searching for their idea of rural heaven. So far, however, Sandford doesn't seem to have felt the effects of this gruesome 21st century invasion. I've not yet been drawn into the controversial argument about the pros and cons of the suburban sanitisation this part of the region has suffered. I probably will at some stage, but not today. Instead, I will enjoy the fact that this little village appears completely unspoiled. There are 2 splendid houses in Sandford, only one of which, however, is visible from the road, and that one is called Sandford Park. This lovely house, built in the early 18th century, is right opposite the church and is visible through the beautiful wrought iron gates. For me, it's the perfect example of Cotswold grace and beauty. It's surrounded by a classic English park and garden, which isn't generally open to the public, but there are, as is so often the case in this area, opportunities on certain occasions or local events to see them. 2 substantial artificial lakes, created from a tributary to the River Dawn, are spanned by a 7-arched mid-18th century stone bridge. In the 1930s, a rock garden was constructed with watery cascades and summer houses. The stable block, a lodge with Dutch gables, and a dovecote, now converted into a cottage, give this estate a wonderfully complete and busy feel. Most importantly, it gives the sense that it's well maintained by someone who appreciates the beauty that comes with age. The church, dedicated to St Martin of Tours, dates from around 1200 and is built of a mixture of the local grey limestone and the ironstone we've come across before in the northern part of our travels. St Martin was born in 316 AD and followed in the footsteps of his soldier father. Famously, he came across a poor man begging in the freezing cold outside the gates of Amiens. He drew his sword and cut his heavy army cloak in 2, giving half to the beggar to keep him warm, and dressing himself in the mutilated remains. His charitable instincts drew him to resign from the army and to join the church. It is this story that brings us here, because as part of the septcentenary celebrations in this church, they commissioned a window from the titan of stained glass in the 20th century, John Piper. Piper was the artist who designed the baptistry window in the new Coventry Cathedral, built in the 1960s to replace the cathedral destroyed in the war. That window, made up of 195 bright panels, is perhaps the most spectacular modern stained glass window in the world, and is particularly close to my heart. John Piper and his wife Mfanwe were friends of my parents, and I grew up close to their home and friends with their children. I saw the extraordinary baptistry window in small pieces in his remarkable barn studio near Henley-on-Thames, long before it was installed. I've always loved his work. The small window in the church at Sandford portrays St Martin's act of charity outside Amiens, depicting the hand of God guiding Martin to use his sword to divide his cloak. It was installed in 1973. There is more lovely glass in this little church. The east window dates from the mid-19th century, made by Holland of Warwick, designed either by O'Connor or Gibbs, depending on who you believe, and there are fragments of medieval glass in the south aisle. There's an amazing royal arms of Queen Elizabeth I. You'll see the English lion and the Tudor dragon, and a great collection of hatchments over the chancel arch. The organ was built in 1901 as a memorial to Dr. Edwin Guest and his wife, and the font is probably pre-Norman and the oldest object in the building. I am really pleased to have finally made it here to show you this place. It hasn't let us down. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Sandford St Martin. It's interesting, we're right on the edge of the very sophisticated centre of the Cotswolds, which is now so grand, But this village doesn't feel like that. It feels warm and friendly and peaceful the way the old-fashioned Cotswolds always did. We've had a lovely time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the usual platforms, and we'll be back in the Cotswolds very soon. We'll see you then.